What makes a man who appears to have everything under control suddenly panic when his partner arrives 5 minutes late? Picture this. He's successful, confident, seemingly unshakable. Yet the moment something doesn't go according to his plan, an unexpected intensity erupts from within him. Sigmund Freud discovered more than a century ago that the strongest facades often conceal the deepest vulnerabilities. What we interpret as strength is frequently the opposite, a desperate attempt by the unconscious to drown out the greatest fears. Psychoanalysis teaches us that every person carries an invisible map of their wounds within them. For men who want to appear strong, this map becomes particularly artfully hidden. They develop sophisticated defense mechanisms that function like emotional armor. But this armor has cracks, and these cracks reveal everything. In the coming minutes, we'll decode 6 hidden signals that even the strongest man cannot conceal. If you want to explore the secrets of human psychology further, subscribe now, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you see relationships. The first and most obvious signal reveals itself in his compulsive need to control every situation, from choosing restaurants to vacation planning, from daily routines to conversation flow. Imagine this. You spontaneously suggest going to a different restaurant tonight than originally planned. Suddenly he becomes restless, finds 1,000 reasons why that won't work, and insists on sticking to the original plan. Or observe him at a social gathering. He orchestrates every aspect, from the music to the conversation topics. What appears to be admirable organizational ability is actually a cry for help from his psyche. Freud recognized that excessive control is a classic defense mechanism, reaction formation. The unconscious reverses the true fear into its opposite. A man who must control everything is actually terrified of losing control. This fear often roots in early experiences of helplessness. Perhaps he experienced chaotic family structures as a child, emotional unpredictability from parents, or felt helplessly subjected to the moods of his caregivers. Adult controlling behavior is his attempt to overcome that original powerlessness. Every small planned change unconsciously activates those old fears. His mind interprets flexibility as a threat because his unconscious equates flexibility with the chaos of his childhood. He clings to routines and predictability because they provide the emotional security he never had as a child. The psychoanalytic explanation goes even deeper. Control becomes his primary coping mechanism against castration anxiety, the unconscious fear of losing power and identity. By controlling his environment, he tries to combat the inner fear of his own disappearance. The irony of this mechanism is brutal. The more he controls, the more vulnerable he actually becomes. Every situation beyond his control, a delayed train, a cancelled appointment, a spontaneous plan change, an unexpected phone call, becomes an emotional crisis. His supposed strength becomes his greatest weakness because the world can never be completely controlled. His behavior becomes particularly revealing in truly important life situations. While he obsessively plans trivial matters, he often fails when facing life's big, uncontrollable challenges, illness, loss, other people's emotional crises. Where real strength would be needed, his facade crumbles because his entire system is built on control. His relationships suffer under this compulsive need for control. Partners feel constrained, patronized, disrespected in their autonomy. Paradoxically, his attempt to control the relationship creates exactly the instability he wants to avoid. People begin to distance themselves, which only reinforces his original fear of losing control. Have you ever witnessed how an apparently strong man completely loses composure when something unexpected happens? How his entire personality begins to waver when the perfect plan falls apart? The second signal you'll recognize when he suddenly becomes a cool analyst in emotional moments. Distant, factual, seemingly rational, as if observing a scientific experiment instead of living a human relationship. Picture this. You tell him you feel hurt by something he said. Instead of accepting your feelings or showing empathy, he immediately begins analyzing. That's irrational of you, or you're reading too much into it, or objectively speaking, my statement was completely neutral. He switches to a factual, almost professional mode, as if writing a psychological assessment. What looks like emotional maturity and intellectual superiority is actually pure panic about his own feelings. Freud called this mechanism intellectualization, a sophisticated form of repression. The unconscious protects itself from overwhelming emotions by shifting them to the rational realm where they become harmless. A man who reacts with emotional distance is actually terrified of being overwhelmed by his own feelings and thereby becoming vulnerable. This fear often originates in early childhood when emotional expressions were valued as weakness, ridiculed, or even punished. His mind learned a fundamental but tragic lesson. Feelings are dangerous. They make you vulnerable, uncontrollable, weak. So he develops an emotional firewall, a highly developed protective system. As soon as strong emotions arise, his own or others, his psychological warning system automatically switches to analysis mode. He sublimates threatening emotions into intellectual processes, transforms feeling into thought. This sublimation follows an unconscious calculation. What I understand cannot hurt me. What I can explain loses its threatening power. His intellect becomes a weapon against his own humanity. He dissects emotions like a surgeon dissects an organ, coolly, precisely, without being touched himself. The tragic aspect of this mechanism, his very flight from feelings, reveals how intensely he feels. A truly emotionally cold person wouldn't need to flee from emotions. He simply wouldn't perceive them. His distancing is irrefutable proof that beneath his controlled surface, an emotional volcano is brewing. He's just panically afraid of the eruption, of the moment when his feelings might be stronger than his mind. This emotional armor increasingly isolates him from all human connections. The more he rationalizes, the lonelier he becomes. The more often he analyzes away feelings, the more foreign he becomes to himself and others. His unconscious desperately longs for emotional connection, for real contact, for the feeling of being understood and accepted. But his mind systematically sabotages every attempt at closeness. He becomes a prisoner of his own defenses, trapped in a tower of logic and analysis. His relationships become intellectual discourses instead of emotional encounters. People around him feel misunderstood, unheard, emotionally starved. Do you recognize this pattern? Have you experienced how a man runs from his own feelings by systematically analyzing them away and filtering the humanity out of every encounter? Yet the third signal is even more subtle and insidious. It shows in how he speaks, even when nobody is listening. The third signal you'll recognize by his constant explaining of why he does something, even when nobody asked, nobody doubts, and nobody expects or needs justification. Picture this. He arrives 10 minutes later than agreed and immediately begins a detailed explanation about traffic, poor traffic light timing, the unexpected construction, and why he's actually always punctual and this delay is an absolute exception. Or observe him making everyday decisions. He justifies his career choice, his hobbies, his political opinions, even his clothing, permanently and unprompted. What seems like transparency and communicativeness is actually the expression of his deepest self-doubt. Freud recognized in this behavior the projection of an overly strict and demanding superego. The unconscious has developed an internal authority that permanently criticizes, evaluates, judges, and is never satisfied. This merciless inner voice is often an internalization of early authority figures, usually parents who were never satisfied, whose love was tied to perfect performance, or who constantly questioned and criticized the child. A man who constantly justifies himself is actually conducting a permanent internal court proceeding. His punishing superego accuses him. His weak ego desperately defends against charges that are often completely unfounded. What's supposed to look like self-confidence on the outside betrays his fundamental inner insecurity. He anticipates criticism because he holds himself trapped in an endless cycle of self-criticism. This justification addiction becomes a psychological vicious cycle. The more he explains, the more suspicious he appears to other people. People intuitively sense someone who truly behaves innocently and has a clear conscience doesn't need to constantly justify themselves. His excessive explanations work like unconscious admissions of guilt, even though he's often justifying completely mundane, harmless things. The unconscious betrays itself through this emotional overreaction. A self-confident, internally grounded person would simply say, "Sorry, I'm late." An internally insecure man, eaten away by self-doubt, needs a 5-minute detailed explanation for a 1-minute delay. His endless justifications are desperate cries for help from his wounded, fragile self-worth. It becomes particularly revealing and tragic when he even justifies his successes. "I was just lucky," or "It really wasn't that hard," or "Others could have done it too," as if he's not allowed to feel legitimate pride, as if every success were fraud. His unconscious has completely internalized the destructive message: you don't deserve recognition, respect, or positive attention. This permanent self-justification exhausts not only himself, but also everyone around him. Conversations become one-sided monologues of self-defense. Relationships suffer under the constant defensiveness. People begin to actually mistrust him, not because of his actions, but because of his neurotic attempts at explanation. His original attempt to create trust achieves the opposite. The justifications meant to protect him increasingly isolate him. Have you ever experienced how someone transforms a simple delay into a 20-minute complicated apology? How a normal situation suddenly becomes a case for defense? The fourth signal you'll recognize by his completely disproportionate, explosive reaction to the smallest criticism. A harmless, factual objection suddenly becomes an existential attack on his entire person and identity. Imagine this. You mention casually and kindly that he might use a little less salt when cooking. Suddenly he explodes like a volcano. "You always criticize everything about me. I can never do anything right for you. Nothing is ever good enough for you. Then cook yourself if I'm so terrible." A harmless, well-meaning kitchen suggestion transforms into a dramatic, fundamental discussion about his right to exist as a man and partner. What looks like choleric temperament or masculine pride is the desperate fight of a frighteningly fragile self-image for psychological survival. Freud recognized the fundamental conflict between the grandiose ego ideal and the actual imperfect self. The ego ideal, his internalized image of the perfect, flawless, infallible man, is constructed so loftily and unrealistically that even the smallest criticism could bring about its dramatic collapse. His aggressive reaction is a desperate defense mechanism against the unconscious, panicked recognition of his human imperfection. Deep in his unconscious lurks the existential fear of complete exposure as a failure. Over years or decades, he has laboriously built a grandiose, superhuman self-image, the successful, flawless, infallible, admirable man. Every criticism, however minimal and well-intentioned, threatens this artful but unstable house of cards that is his identity. His primitive id drive for psychological self-preservation immediately activates the archaic fight-or-flight response. The psychoanalytic explanation becomes even more devastating. The intensity of his reaction ruthlessly betrays how much he internally agrees with the criticism. A truly self-confident, internally grounded person could calmly say, "You're right. I do oversalt the food sometimes, thanks for pointing that out." His explosive anger is the unmistakable sign that the criticized point has hit an extremely sore, never-healed spot in his psyche. The louder and more aggressively he protests, the more he unconsciously confirms the absolute validity of the criticism. His behavior becomes particularly revealing and tragic with constructive, loving criticism. While destructive, malicious criticism might justify his resistance, his aggression toward helpful, well-meaning suggestions shows the true, frightening cause. He simply cannot bear being seen as an imperfect, fallible, teachable human being. His unconscious interprets every loving suggestion for improvement as devastating proof of his fundamental inadequacy. Criticism isn't understood as information about his behavior, but as a death sentence for his person. This hypersensitivity creates a destructive, vicious cycle. People around him gradually stop giving him honest, constructive feedback because they fear his unpredictable emotional explosions. He becomes increasingly isolated in his self-perception and simultaneously more paranoid and convinced that everyone is against him and wants to sabotage him. His aggression creates exactly the rejection and criticism it was originally meant to protect him from. His anger is actually grief, deep grief over the unattainable ideal he will never meet. Do you recognize this destructive pattern? How a small, loving suggestion suddenly becomes emotional apocalypse? The fifth signal you'll recognize by his compulsive, never-ending chase for success and recognition. He can never achieve enough, prove enough, accomplish enough, be enough to fill the black hole in his soul. Picture this. He just received an important promotion, closed a big business deal, or reached a significant goal. But instead of celebrating, rejoicing, or even relaxing for a moment, he's already obsessively talking about the next, even bigger goal. Success brings him no real satisfaction, no inner peace, only a brief moment of relief before the next merciless test of his self-worth begins. He collects achievements, awards, and successes like an addict collects drugs, but none of them can permanently fill the deep, gaping hole in his soul. What appears to be admirable ambition and determination is the desperate attempt to prove to an invisible, never-satisfied inner judge that he deserves to exist. Freud recognized in this pathological performance fixation the devastating aftermath of the unresolved Oedipus complex and deeply rooted castration anxiety. In the crucial psychosexual development phase, the little boy learned that he must compete with the overpowering, threatening father to obtain the desired love and recognition from his mother. This existential, archaic, competitive situation shapes his entire adult life. He permanently fights against a powerful, internalized father rival who can never be defeated. His unconscious has internalized a destructive but unshakable core belief. You are only worth what you achieve. Your right to exist depends on your successes. Love, recognition, and respect were tied to strict conditions in his formative childhood. Perfect grades, athletic success, flawless behavior, constant peak performance. The desperate child learned the fundamental lesson. His worth as a human being depends exclusively on his measurable performance. The adult man unconsciously continues this hopeless fight, even though the original merciless judge has long disappeared or died. The tragic irony of this mechanism: the more he achieves, the emptier and more desperate he feels internally. Success cannot heal existential spiritual wounds. Every milestone reached only exposes the fundamental meaninglessness and hopelessness of his endless chase. His unconscious recognizes with brutal clarity, even the greatest conceivable success will never make him someone who is unconditionally loved and valued. His behavior becomes particularly telling and painful when he cannot tolerate other people's successes. Envy, resentment, and competitive thinking show that he experiences success as a cruel zero-sum game. When others win, he automatically loses. His unconscious still desperately fights for the seemingly limited, rare resource of paternal recognition, as if there weren't enough love, respect, and appreciation for all people. This compulsive pursuit of achievement becomes a golden but inescapable prison cell. He can never relax, never be satisfied, never enjoy life or appreciate the moment. Every moment of rest becomes an existential threat because it's not productive, not performance-oriented. His greatest panicked fear that someone will discover who he really is without his impressive achievements and successes. A small, frightened boy who just wants to be loved. Have you ever witnessed someone define their entire human worth exclusively through external successes while completely forgetting to live? The sixth and most revealing signal you'll recognize by how he systematically creates distance and sabotages the relationship precisely when it becomes most intimate, trusting, and loving. He destroys the closeness his soul most desperately craves. Picture this. The relationship is developing beautifully. You're becoming increasingly close to each other. The emotional connection deepens and becomes more authentic. Intimacy grows naturally and beautifully. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he becomes unreliable, starts criticizing trivial things, provokes groundless arguments, or withdraws emotionally and physically. He suddenly finds 1,000 reasons why the relationship cannot work, even though it's working perfectly, and both are happy. He looks for flaws where there are none, creates problems where none exist. What seems like emotional immaturity or relationship incapacity is the desperate but self-destructive protection against his greatest existential fear, being completely seen, known, and understood, yet still being abandoned. Freud recognized in pathological attachment anxiety the traumatic transference of early destructive object relationships onto all later intimate connections. In his formative childhood, he very likely experienced profoundly inconsistent, unpredictable love. Caregivers who were loving, tender, and attentive one moment and cold, rejecting, or even cruel the next. People who were physically present and then suddenly emotionally disappeared. His developing unconscious learned the devastating fundamental lesson: closeness inevitably leads to pain. Those who open up will sooner or later be brutally hurt. Love is dangerous because it can be taken away at any time. His adult attachment behavior is a tragic but, from his perspective, completely logical attempt at emotional self-preservation. Before he can be abandoned, he preemptively abandons. Before he can be disappointed, he disappoints the other first. Before his imperfection is discovered, he sabotages the relationship. His unconscious follows a perverse but, for the wounded child within him, absolutely logical reasoning. If I don't allow real closeness, nobody can break my heart. The paradoxical and heartbreaking truth, his intense attachment anxiety is irrefutable proof of how desperately he longs for real attachment. A person who truly didn't care about closeness and intimacy wouldn't have panicked fear of it. His flight from love shows how existentially important it is to him. Every distancing is simultaneously a suppressed cry for closeness, every sabotage a hidden cry for help. His self-destructive behavior becomes particularly revealing and tragic in the happiest, most harmonious moments of the relationship. Precisely when everything is perfect, when both feel loved and understood, he becomes internally restless and begins the destruction. His unconscious cannot tolerate happiness because it has internalized the painful lesson. After emotional highs always come brutal lows. He destroys happiness preemptively to spare himself the anticipated pain of inevitable loss. This systematic self-sabotage becomes a cruel, self-fulfilling destiny. Through his behavior, he creates exactly the rejection, disappointment, and abandonment he originally wanted to protect himself from. Partners become exhausted by his tests, his emotional inaccessibility, his groundless provocations. They eventually leave, confirming his original destructive conviction: love is not permanent. People always abandon you. His deepest, most painful secret, beneath the laboriously constructed mask of strength, hides a small, frightened boy who wants nothing more than to be unconditionally loved, safely, permanently, forever. Sigmund Freud taught us this revolutionary insight. The strongest emotional masks always hide the deepest spiritual wounds. A man who desperately wants to appear strong is not strong. He is deeply frightened, wounded, and desperate. His facade is not his strength, but his desperate cry for help. True human strength lies in the courage for vulnerability, the courage for authenticity, the courage for humble acceptance of one's own imperfection. What hidden, painful truth in your own heart could fundamentally transform your life if you found the courage to lovingly accept it? Drop a comment telling us which state you're watching from. I personally read every single comment and love seeing our growing community of brave souls who have the courage to look deeper. If this video helped you understand the complex human psyche better, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more psychological insights.